Welcome back to season 5 of Quiet the Diet. I am your host, integrative functional registered dietitian, Michelle Shapiro, and I am so excited to be back. This season is so much about bringing science to real life and how do we turn these concepts that we keep seeing in the scientific world into things that matter to us and things that we see kind of on social media per usual. We're going to myth bust a little bit of what we're seeing on social media and talk about how do we kind of decipher, again, what's real, what's usable for us, and what's just some people posting to boost their own egos instead. This episode is particularly special because I have brought on a guest that I have been a follower of for years, someone who I think embodies what a really non-ego driven, heart-centered nutritionist is. Mr. Tim Frie, and I'm going to tell you about him in just a moment. First, I want to talk about what this episode is about. Okay, we are going to be talking about very sensitive topics in this episode. So I am issuing a trigger warning if this is not the right place for you, if you're kind of listening on a drive or at work or somewhere where you feel like you can't focus and feel comfortable. We are going to be talking about trauma in today's episode. Of course, we're talking about trauma from a functional nutrition perspective, but we are going to be discussing stronger themes, talking about really what is this relationship between trauma and autoimmunity? What's the relationship between the trauma that we experience in childhood and how does that translate into immune conditions or mental health conditions later in life? And how all of that happens through a biological neuronutrition lens. I'm smiling when I say neuronutrition because this is what our guest refers to himself as. Timothy Frie is a neuronutritionist, nutritional neuroscience researcher, writer, educator, and health equity activist. He is the founder and CEO of the Georgia Center for Neuronutrition, GCNN for short, the Southeastern United States' first and only neuronutrition clinic. What I've been seeing on social media recently regarding trauma is a lot about cortisol, a lot about fight or flight, a lot about big T versus little t. And what it's kind of translated to in a lot of my clients is this experience of feeling like my trauma isn't big enough. My trauma isn't substantial enough for it to have impacted me later in life. And what Tim and I really uncover on this episode is how impactful are these childhood events that we have, even if they seem like that little t trauma, on how our genes are expressed later in life, how our cell structure is later in life, and how our body reacts to trauma overall. What I think is very misunderstood about trauma is that it seems that people express it to be something like it's this thing that's in your body that needs to be released, when what I think we really talk about in this episode and uncover is that trauma is an event that creates a reaction in the body, and that body perpetuates that reaction. And that's where a lot of that HPA axis dysregulation comes from. So I want to, again, just be really sensitive to say, we go there, so to speak, in this episode. I don't know if any of you grew up watching Degrassi, but it goes there. It does. And we talk about, again, strong themes. So I just want you to be mindful of that. And most importantly, the goal of this episode is to lay the biological framework for which we understand trauma and nutrition to be related, for which we understand trauma and immunity to be related, and then to give some really hopeful messages about how impactful nutrition intervention can be when it comes to trauma. Tim on social media, his name is Nutrition for Trauma. That's exactly what this episode is about, is what nutrition interventions specifically work for trauma. I am elated to have Tim here, and I wanted to give him just a little bit more of a spotlight even about what his work is and how he kind of sees all of this being interconnected. I will also let you know that much like another guest on this season, Tim came into this episode with a 19-page outline, and I'm a podcast host. I'm the one who makes the outlines. So Tim and our other guest later in the season both did a lot of the legwork and kind of heavy lifting for these episodes. So I'm just so proud about what you're about to learn. I hope it gives you hope as opposed to feeling like it takes away hope. And if you are already working with a therapist, we just want to double express how incredible of an opportunity you have to be able to have access to therapy, trauma therapy. This episode is by no means a replacement for medical care, psychological care of any kind. This is just to show that you can impact how safe your body feels through functional nutrition intervention in a really incredible way. So really excited to talk about that bottom-up approach to trauma, just like we talk about the bottom-up approach to anxiety in many past episodes. A little bit more about Tim is that he has pioneered an emerging approach to traumatic stress, autoimmunity, and neuroinflammatory diseases that integrates innovative and novel applications of precision nutrition and applied nutritional neuroscience with narrative medicine, medical sociology, and he specializes in working with people who have experienced traumatic stress and subsequently developed an autoimmune or neuroinflammatory diseases. He practices through a trauma-informed and neuroaffirming lens, censoring the principles of consent, choice, collaboration, and safety. He acknowledges the systemic, political, environmental, and ancestry or evolutionary variables that impact his clients' health. And he now has a private neuronutrition practice where he works one-on-one with clients virtually, by application only, and through the state of Georgia at the GCNN. Oh, Tim is a light for all of us. I learned so much from him in what you're about to hear in the next hour and a half episode. Buckle up, be conscious and compassionate to yourself for what you might be experiencing. And again, this is not at all a substitute for medical care, nutrition care, but we really do hope you enjoy it. I'm shaking kind of, Tim. I'm so excited. I'm kind of freaking out right now. This is it. This is like opening episode of season 5 for a reason. I am overjoyed thinking about this episode. Literally for years, I've been following you. I'm so excited to have you here, Tim Frie.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I am equally as excited, if not more. I mean, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about something that not only impacted me and completely changed my life, this has changed my family's life, it's changed my life, and maybe it will change the life of someone listening to this. So
I know it will. God, am I crying? I'm not even kidding. I just started crying. Oh no. I've never had that experience before within 30 seconds of crying in an episode. Tim, we are on the very, very, very high level. We are going to talk about trauma today. We are going to talk about how trauma influences our health in really biochemical ways, because I think the conversation around trauma, it's been so co-opted by vagus nerve conversations. It's been co-opted by like treating, balancing the nervous system, hormones conversation. So I'm really excited to kind of dive into the reality and tangibility of trauma. Have you been seeing that a lot too, where the conversation around trauma has kind of slipped away from us into this different conversation?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the conversation about trauma online, it's one extreme or another. It's like we're talking about solely the biology of it, and we're talking about the vagus nerve, or we're on the other end of the spectrum, which is we're only talking about like the psychological and mental component of it. And now I'm seeing arguments, people in the comments are like, this is trauma. That's not actually trauma. Why are you co-opting this terminology? And we have people saying they're trauma informed and they don't really know what that means. So totally, it's, the conversation about trauma is really all over the place right now.
This also brings up, just again on this high level before we nitty gritty the rest of the conversation. For you, when you use the word trauma, are you referring to only big traumas? Are you referring to the accumulation of what would be like the little t, big T, another kind of these catchphrases that we've been hearing a lot? What does trauma, when we're talking about in this context of the conversation, mean to you, and how do you use it in your work?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, when I use the word trauma, or I say traumatic stress or PTSD, which I actually kind of hate the diagnosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm looking at it as the psychoneuroimmunological injury that occurs as a result of the event. So for me, it's not really about, is it a big T or a little t event? It's about what happens in our body and our brain and our mind in response to that experience. So when I say trauma or traumatic stress, I'm talking about the experience in our body, our brain, and our mind.
Thank you for saying that. And I have a lot of very aggressive New Yorker clients who always say to me, my childhood was good and everything's fine. And Michelle, I can handle a lot of stress. And I'm like, oh, let me tell you something. Mentally, you're one of the most resilient people ever. And I can basically be talking to any of my clients when I'm saying this. They are the most resilient, incredible people in the entire world. But what we're talking about and will be talking about is how even those small experiences can shape and form how our body acts and reacts for, Tim, like the rest of our lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, trauma is, it's one of those things where I think a lot of people have experienced it, but they they think it means something bad about them if they experience trauma or they use that actual word, right? Because, we live in a culture here in the US or in the West, and really this is pervasive throughout the world, really, where if you are a victim or you've been abused or you say I've experienced trauma, then you're weak, and that's something to be ashamed of because you're lesser. And, I just completely disagree with that. You can be a victim and still be resilient and still be capable of growth, recovery, and healing. So yes, yes.
Yeah, totally. And the word victim is interesting. It's something that you and I have talked about just like personally, professionally, offline, something we definitely are going to talk about too. We kind of wanted to start this conversation also with something called an ACE survey. So again, when we are talking about trauma in any form, it's really interesting because trauma is also something that is owned, and I'm putting that in quotes, by psychological authority, but it is quite relevant to the nutrition work that we do. And Tim, you refer to yourself as a neuronutritionist because you are a neuronutritionist. How can we, as true nutritionists, how are we allowed to be talking about trauma? Why are we allowed to be talking about trauma in a space that's owned by psychologists?
Yeah. Sounds like kind of a bizarre question when you put it that way. I'm like, what do you mean? Why are we allowed to talk about trauma? Yeah. So, trauma, when we, and we'll talk about some of this, but when you kind of zoom out and you look at all of the biology and the neuroscience behind trauma, all of those pathways, you can trace them back to something that is dependent on a nutrient, a vitamin or a mineral. All of these cellular things that happen in our body need vitamins, need minerals, need nutrition. And, I think nutrition has kind of become this, it's become this field where people think, nutritionists tell people what to eat and what not to eat, or they give you a meal plan. But nutrition science is the fundamental basis of life. What do our cells need to exist? So, when we're talking about a traumatic injury or something that causes a biological and cellular change in our body, there are, from my perspective, very obvious nutritional implications for that. So, trauma is a nutritional concern. So that's why we're allowed and should be talking about it.
Exactly right. And it is a nutritional concern. And I also view stress and trauma as being very physical. And I talk about this a lot with clients, and exactly like what you just said, it's very chemical. It's very biological. It is not something that happens in this isolated to the brain way. Our brain is not cut off from the rest of our body. It is happening throughout our body. And really what I think we're going to uncover, and what you and I would certainly agree on and have agreed on, is that it's not only, like you said, this initial impetus or this initial event, but that our bodies are so highly intelligent that our biological and chemical processes will follow suit from that event to basically, in whatever way possible it is, protect from that event happening again, protect from the damage of that event. And what I'm seeing broadly is a lot of people's bodies in a constant state of protection. Another word that I find to be quite triggering now because of its overuse is this fight or flight. So I think we're going to talk about that, I'm sure, at some point too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there is this 10 question survey that Tim is going to say, no, Michelle, actually there's 4 additional questions that we're going to talk about, called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey. And the survey was developed to help understand the relationship between, or was later used actually to understand the relationship between autoimmunity and trauma, which is Tim's bread and butter. It is where he lives. It is where he loves to live, is that relationship between either childhood experiences or adult experiences and how they relate to how the body acts and how that can turn into these autoimmune conditions kind of popping up. A lot of times when people talk about this ACE survey, this ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, they talk about it in a very, again, intangible way. They talk about if something happened in childhood, maybe you're going to have an experience in adulthood. I kind of want to just go through what the questions of the survey are. Tim's going to lay out some caveats for us and some things to consider. This is by no means diagnostic in nature. What I want us to do in this episode is just open up the conversation about how the events of our life can influence our nutritional status and how our nutritional status can influence our overall health once those events have happened. So, Tim, tell us your caveats and things to consider when it comes to the ACE survey. Again, we're just bringing up these questions for people to ponder on. This is not diagnostic in nature, not medical advice or nutrition advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think if you're listening to this and you're hearing one of these questions and you're like, maybe I'm not sure, possibly that could have happened to me. I've found in my experience working with people that if your answer is a maybe, it's a yes. And I think this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about this kind of cultural stigma or stereotype surrounding what it means to have experienced these things. And, I don't know which version of the questions you have or, which one you're going to read, but some versions of the ACE questionnaire will say explicitly even once or just one time. So as you're listening to this, if you experience this even one time, your answer is also yes. I think the other thing too, I just want to throw out there, this might be kind of alarming to some people, but I think this is important. An ACE score of 2 or greater has been associated with an increased risk of disease. And we'll get into that later. But an ACE score of 4 or greater, we'll get into the specifics, but yeah, go for it.
An ACE score of, I like the suspense of it. I will dispel a little bit of suspense. At some point, the scores, when they were doing research, they said, we actually can't report on this research because the scores were so correlative that they almost look causative, and they almost think that they're going to think we're lying, is how compelling the research was. Did you read that too, Tim?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the other thing too, on that note, I think it's important here. There's a lot of people that, I don't want to say they're like trauma deniers, but maybe they are. They'll say, well, we don't have, like randomized controlled trials. We have no proof that, these ACEs or traumatic experiences do cause autoimmune disease or whatever. But the thing is, we'll never get that causative study because it would be unethical for a researcher to design a study where you would have to intentionally expose children to this adversity and then, follow them longitudinally, for 25, 30 years and see how those traumatic experiences impacted their health. So from my perspective and from my practice, the association is strong enough that you can kind of connect A to B, even though the science doesn't say with absolute certainty that you can. So
what science says anything with absolute certainty? Come on. It's like, and also the science does point to that, even though the science is not definitive. The science, wow, does it point to it? And we'll talk about that science too.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the adverse childhood experiences survey that I have. Again, all of them are a little bit different depending on their adaptations. And Tim is going to add some caveats throughout, and feel free, Tim, to just jump in. Again, not diagnostic in nature. Just want us to consider how these events that seem small, or these type of events that seem small, may actually impact our health later on. So the question is, prior to your 18th birthday, the first question is, did a parent or another adult in your household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you feel afraid that you may be physically hurt? The second question is, did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Question 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touched their body in a sexual way, or attempts to touch you or touch you inappropriately? Question 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or feel that your family members didn't look out for one another, feel close to one another, or support one another? Question 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or that your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or to take you to the doctor if you needed it? Question 6, was a biological parent ever lost to you through divorce, abandonment, or another reason? Question 7, was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or have something thrown at her? Or was she sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over the course of at least a few minutes, or threatened with a gun or a knife? Question 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic, or who used street drugs? Question 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Question 10, did a household member go to prison? Okay. Tim, do you want to add your question? Yeah, I know. I feel like now it's hard to talk about it because I feel so taken in by experiences that I know my clients have had, that I've had. So I'm just having a moment for that while I'm reading them too.
Yeah. Well, I'll just share, my ACE score is 8. That's what mine is. And, when I first learned about this and learned about ACEs, I feel like I kind of experienced this season of grief for a while because, this made so much sense. So if this is your first time listening to this right now and you're like, Wow, I have experienced a lot of those things. I hear you. And it is a lot. It can be a lot to digest at once. So, there's a version of this. There's a few different what are called expanded ACE questionnaires that basically, because what the original 10 questions kind of look at is abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, or there's three categories of those questions. When you zoom out a little bit, we have like institutional and community trauma. So, some of those other questions look at like economic hardship. So did your family ever struggle to pay for basic needs like food and housing? Another question looks at discrimination. Have you ever felt discriminated against because of your race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation? Bullying. Were you ever bullied by your peers or adults at school? And then the fourth question is community violence. Did you ever witness violence in your neighborhood or in your community? And there's some other variations of this that look at like family dynamics. Were you in the foster care system, or did you ever feel like you lacked emotional support from your family and community? So these kind of speak more to what would be considered like those little t traumas.
Absolutely. And again, the research for this correlation between the ACE scores and what health events are later in life is so substantial. And there was one statistic I wanted to share that 10% of men with an ACE score of 1 suffer from chronic depression, and 18% of women do. 33% of men with an ACE score of 4 or more later develop depression, while nearly 60% of women with that score develop chronic depression in adulthood. Again, that's just one type of possible result. I guess interesting, and it's like hard to talk about what's interesting when it's coming to like really, really intense stuff and sad stuff, is that the correlations are just as strong for immune diseases and autoimmunity. Yeah. And that's not what we would expect, right? We wouldn't expect for you to have an experience in childhood, be told to get over it, like all of us, right? And then it show up later in life as an immune condition. Mm-hmm. Tim, can you start to unpack for us what happens here on a biological level? What is going on with that?
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to share, I started to earlier, but, there was some research where they looked at thyroiditis, like Graves' disease and Hashimoto's, two autoimmune conditions that impact the thyroid. And they found that people with an ACE score of 4 or greater, have a 50% increased risk of developing an autoimmune thyroid condition compared to those who had an ACE score of 0 to 1. And when you look at the correlation between ACEs and autoimmunity, I mean, it's pretty clear. Lupus, fibromyalgia, MS, Sjogren's, greater symptom severity in people who have more ACEs. So you have like this dose-dependent relationship. So the more severe the trauma, the more severe your symptoms. So, kind of learning about that too, like the correlation between more trauma, more immunity, that's a clue. That's a pretty big clue.
100%.
So
yeah. The one thing I want to say about all this too, before we do dive in, is there's like the phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It's like, what doesn't kill you makes you traumatized. I don't know. It's like, it's not, there is some research too that shows that like resilient responses to trauma do confer some level of benefit, but all you're doing is deterring negative outcomes. You're not, it's not like great, it's not like anyone can be looking and be like, this is good because it made you stronger. It doesn't really lay the groundwork for a stable immune or even emotional response to things.
Yeah. Like, trauma is never protective, like experiencing adversity in your childhood or developmental trauma or being discriminated against, it will never prevent anything, And, I think these conversations about like grit and resilience, it's like, well, these things kind of toughen you or they, increase your resilience or grit. And that's not actually true. Resilience there's dozens of factors that influence our resilience. And if you don't or cannot experience post-traumatic growth, or you do not receive the support and care that you need after trauma, that's actually a deterrent to your resiliency. So I completely agree with you. So let's unpack the neurobiology of this a little bit. So I'll do this the best that I can. We'll start with what I think most people see and know the most about when we talk about traumatic stress or chronic stress, and that's the HPA axis. So the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis. This is basically, oversimplification. It's our body's stress response system. It is a connection and feedback loop and a communication cycle between the pituitary gland and hypothalamus in our brain and our adrenal glands, which sit on top of our kidneys. So the hypothalamus it's located at the base of the brain, and this is responsible for endocrine regulation. So the hypothalamus this is our body's kind of internal balance regulator. It plays a role in hunger and sleep and body temperature and our circadian rhythm. So if you think about even that right off the bat, if we know that traumatic stress impacts the function of the hypothalamus, that could explain the insomnia and some of the sleep and nightmares, that are some of the sleep challenges and nightmares that people experience when they have trauma. It could explain some of the, issues with like satiation and increased appetite or under eating that people experience when they have trauma. So then the second part of this HPA axis is the pituitary gland. And it's this really tiny, like pea-sized gland that sits just below the hypothalamus. And this is responsible for all kinds of different hormones. So it stimulates the adrenal glands, which is kind of the third part of, this HPA axis. It plays an important role in sending out thyroid stimulating hormone, which is important for our thyroid function. It produces growth hormone and some of the other like sex hormones related to like breastfeeding and testosterone and like estrogen, production and things like that in women that are related to, reproductive function. So then we have the back part of the pituitary gland as well. That's kind of what the front part, or the anterior portion of the pituitary gland does. And then we have the posterior portion, and that produces, oxytocin, which is, really important for childbirth and social bonding, and something called antidiuretic hormone, which kind of regulates our, fluid balance and water and plays, some role in, how our kidneys function. And then the third part of this HPA axis is the adrenal glands. And these are kind of small glands that sit on top of our kidneys. And there's two parts. We have the cortex, which is kind of like the center. And this is what produces cortisol. So this is that stress hormone that everybody talks about. Everybody's worried about their high cortisol and chronic exposure to cortisol. Cortisol doesn't just increase when we have stress and while we have high cortisol. This high cortisol can impair our blood sugar metabolism in our cells. It sends a lot of different signals to different immune cells to tell our immune system to either chill or get ready for something. And it also plays a big role in our electrolyte balance. So, sodium, magnesium, potassium, and things like that. It also produces, aldosterone, which is part of that fluid and electrolyte balance mechanism, and different androgens, so different sex hormones that play a role in like our libido and our sex drive. And then the other really big important thing that the adrenal glands do is they produce what are called catecholamines. So these are things like adrenaline or epinephrine, and this is what really drives what we know as the fight or flight response, which we'll get into that. I think we've really oversimplified or exaggerated what that really means. But, when your adrenal glands produce these catecholamines, this basically turns on your nervous system. It speeds up your heart rate. It speeds up your respiration rate. It causes your blood pressure to go up. So, just if we pause there for a second and we think about that alone, this HPA axis, knowing what these things do, to me, it just kind of makes sense, why chronic HPA axis dysregulation would lead to so much downstream immune system dysfunction.
I think that's really, really good at laying the groundwork. And again, what I need everyone to hear me saying is that this traumatic event as it happens, it basically puts the body on notice that this thing can happen again. So our bodies are so intelligent and they want to prevent bad things from happening. And when we acknowledge something is bad and has happened that is bad, or our body intuitively understands that that thing is not good, our body starts to behave in a different way and then continues to behave in that way. And I see this obviously a lot in cases of MCAS and POTS and any sort of dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, is that the body just starts living in that state. Now, some people would call this HPA axis dysregulation. They would call this the fight or flight state, which I don't really agree with as being all encompassing either. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the fight or flight conversation. And then I want to go through the other mechanisms by which trauma influences the way our body acts. And also if it does cause any physical or cellular damage or anything like that too.
Yeah. So, kind of related to what you just said, so the HPA axis can either hyperactivate or activate all of the things that it does in its response. So if the HPA axis is hyperactivated, then you have really high levels of cortisol for a long period of time. The cortisol can actually damage the brain. It can cause neuronal damage. It can cause your, different parts of the brain to atrophy or shrink. And you can have these anatomical changes where it will, parts of the brain will get smaller or they'll get bigger. If you think about, cortisol getting into the brain for long enough of a period of time where it's affecting your hippocampus, which is largely responsible for your memory and emotional dysregulation, well, then that's what kind of causes some of these hyperarousal symptoms related to trauma. So, being kind of like easily startled or, hypervigilance, where we're just always constantly looking for something that might hurt us or harm us. And that's kind of what most people, I think, know as anxiety. So the other end of that spectrum is hypoactivation, where you have high levels of cortisol that has basically saturated your adrenal glands. You've been producing so much of it, which that can actually has this kind of interesting mechanism where it tells, since this is a feedback loop between, the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, it can tell your body like, wait, you're producing way too much of this. Chill. We need to slow down. So then you have an impaired stress response, which just results in like systemic dysregulation of so many things, because you have now parts of your body that cannot do what it's supposed to do. And that ultimately is what causes disease. Specifically with regards like the immune system and autoimmunity, high levels of cortisol change the way that your body produces all kinds of different immune cells. And, when you have parts of your immune system that are either underactivated or overactivated for long periods of time, you just kind of end up in this cell danger response, but you end up with your cells thinking that you are perpetually in danger and that you're facing threats. And, our body is really good at handling stress, but not a lot of stress for a long period of time, or a very intense stressor that we have no support with kind of healing from.
I think it's the phrase, a little bit of stress with a really good response is good, and a lot of stress is bad. And then you have to basically, thinking about this feedback loop with the brain structures and our adrenal glands. Again, our body starts to behave and act in a chronic way, thinking just in case there is a famine, just in case there is a disaster, I need to put myself into this kind of like, again, activated or highly activated or underactivated state. I'm just repeating what Tim said so beautifully, which is also that having low circulating cortisol or high circulating cortisol or low metabolized cortisol or low free cortisol can have different impacts on immune function. So the way that our immune system functions, because I think people think it's like you just have white blood cells kind of like running around and that's the immune system. It's like this extremely complex communication system. That's how our immune system works. Some of our immune cells live in certain places and send messages from there. Some travel throughout the body and they either do the repair work themselves or they'll signal to other immune particles to come in and help, basically. What happens is cortisol, again, being this immune signaling molecule, because it actually can influence immune function by telling the immune system to ramp up or slow down, having that unchecked cortisol directly influences what your immune system does. The only way our immune system knows what do I do is through the actions of the brain, through other hormones, through the nutrients required for the immune system to function. But we all have to start viewing the body as this communication system. So when we have clients, either Tim or I coming in, not only are we sitting in the experiences that they've had and appreciating the value of their life experience, we're also understanding what happened to that communication system in the body. Why does the body think it needs to do the things that it's doing? Because sometimes I just want to be like, body, you're being a little dramatic about this. Like, why are you, that's not what I want you to do. So it's that the body, again, I want to use this word, the body behaves or acts in a certain way to prevent further harm. I think when we, again, originally think about trauma, people think that there's this like, it's just in your memory, or it's just this physical thing that happens where it snips your DNA, which we can talk about too. But it's really this deeply complex network of a perpetuating cycle of protection. And what the body does in a state of protection is a little bit odd and has effects and side effects essentially in the long term.
Yeah. Something I was thinking about when you were saying that is, like the role of cytokines in inflammation. I think a lot of people who have autoimmune disease are on these disease modifying drugs or biologic medications that, they decrease the levels of some of these cytokines. So tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 1, interleukin 6, these are immune cells that kind of are called pro-inflammatory cytokines, and they drive inflammation and they direct other cells and basically say, come along, like we need to inflame this body. But it's not for the purposes of attacking the host. That's what, I find so kind of beautiful about our immune system is even when you have autoimmunity and you have autoantibodies where you have this kind of like civil war going on in your body, it's true that part of your body, some of your cells have kind of turned against each other. But in response to that, there's other parts of your immune system and other cells that are like, no, we're going to protect this person. Like, we're not doing this. But the thing is, those conditions, a civil war is not conducive to harmony or balance, so you have, these things that are attacking tissues, and then you have these other things that are trying to protect your tissues. So, when we have high levels of these pro-inflammatory cytokines that are directing our immune cells to keep us inflamed, to protect us and prevent damage from these autoantibodies, it's kind of like, we're causing damage when we're trying to protect ourselves. So it's a catch-22, and, when we have really high levels of these pro-inflammatory cytokines circulating in our blood and getting into our tissues and our organs for long periods of time, other things start to shut down, and, we start to experience these systemic issues. And I think this also kind of speaks to as well why people with autoimmune disease, why it can take so long to get a diagnosis sometimes. And when you're bouncing around from doctor to doctor and you play this game, I call it symptom whack-a-mole, because you have systemic inflammation, and your immune system is producing a response that, kind of directs your entire body in these really important regions of your brain.
What you're saying in that is so important too, that it's not like the body is trying to hurt you when it's doing autoimmune stuff. Your body thinks that the amount of modern stressors and trauma that we have and nutrient deficiencies that we have, it thinks that this is the best path forward. And our bodies are not necessarily equipped to take on the burdens that they are. However, the most important thing that I want to say to people is that there's so much that can be done with all this. So it's not like, the chances of you having all these conditions, almost like a genetic certainty, and, forget it. Now I have to double deal with the fact that I had the trauma in the first place and now deal with the mess of it. Well, it's not like you have to, in order to physically reroute this, that you have to relive the trauma or go to trauma therapy specifically to create a new pathway for your body to choose. Because we basically want to prove to the body, you don't have to do this and run amok and self-attack and do all this. There's a different path and way. Before we talk about what that path and way is, there's two things I want to make sure we cover too. Tell me about cell danger response and how it relates to trauma. And if you can or have any information on DNA and how it's impacted by trauma, I would love to hear that too.
Yeah, I think we'll kind of start with the DNA. And again, pull me out if I get too hung up in the weeds here. So, there's a lot of books and content right now about transgenerational or intergenerational trauma. And I think some people kind of write this off as being like this very spiritual thing. And it is. It can be very spiritual for certain cultures and religions and belief systems. But for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to talk about transgenerational trauma through the lens of biomedicine and neurobiology. So what this basically means is that you have genetic changes spanning generations as a result of multiple generations experiencing different types of trauma. So, we have, behavioral and environmental transmissions of intergenerational trauma. So these are things that are a little bit more kind of like social or more subjective that are passed down. So different parenting styles, or how you discipline your children, or being exposed to or multiple families growing up in a community where there's violence and inequity and injustice and things like that. But then on the genetic or biomedical side, we have a few different mechanisms involved in transgenerational trauma. One of them is DNA methylation, which is something we talk about all the time in functional medicine, but we never seem to zoom in on the DNA methylation concerns related to trauma. Trauma essentially just changes your DNA methylation patterns, and that changes the way that your genetics are expressed. It's epigenetics and all these different exposures and things in life that change the way our genes function and turn on and turn off. The other thing that trauma can impact is histone modification. And these are basically like proteins that wrap around our DNA. And trauma can alter those experiences. And, think about that. We're changing something that protects our DNA. That's going to impact the stress response and immune function and all of these different things that we've been talking about. There's been a lot of different genes that, we're looking at right now for, targeting trauma treatments, which is really kind of fascinating. But, a lot of these different genes that are impacted by trauma are related to these glucocorticoid receptors. So things that the adrenal glands are doing. There's another one that I'm really fascinated by. It's this FKBP5. It's a binding protein, and it basically regulates the sensitivity of like cortisol and these glucocorticoid receptors. There's been, all kinds of research on like the genes that play a role in like brain-derived neurotropic factor, the different genes that play a role in neurogenesis and creating new brain cells, and there's, all of that's like really fascinating and cool to think about. But, I think for me, what we can really do with nutrition and lifestyle is it's kind of the same thing with any other chronic illness like heart disease or, high cholesterol or something like that. We have the ability through our health behaviors and our nutrition related behaviors and our food choices to turn these genes on and off and upregulate and downregulate these things. And when it comes to trauma, we have some degree of influence over that, but ideally we're doing that in a supportive community, and we're surrounded by people who, they not necessarily need to have shared our experience, but they understand why we would want to change those behaviors. And I think a lot of people who have the privilege of not having experienced trauma, it can be really difficult for them to understand like why someone would be so concerned about their nutrition or their health behaviors or their fitness or, their stress levels. They literally have a different genetic makeup. Their body is functioning differently.
Absolutely. And that this genetic piece too, Tim, you might not know the answer to this question. I'm curious what your answer is. Is it proposed that the changes would happen in utero and then they're passed down? Is it proposed that the changes are they truly epigenetic where you see the SNPs? Like how do we perceive intergenerational trauma as passed down?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Theoretically, that kind of makes sense, kind of related to this and the cell danger response, which I can get into in a moment. There's been a lot of research looking at, maternal cortisol levels and health outcomes of the infant or the baby later in life. So, if you think about a mom who has been exposed to domestic violence, some sort of, economic hardship, or, maybe, experiencing, all kinds of trauma during, motherhood, that's going to, impact the biology of the infant. So that's, something that's kind of on my mind when I work with pregnant women, who have experienced trauma and they're, facing a lot of stress now. We need to talk about, how that could potentially impact their child. So let's talk about the cell danger response though, because I think that's really important.
It's a big Tim thing also.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a new thing. This is, something that was just recently proposed. It's relatively new to the literature. And, what the cell danger response is kind of this universal, evolutionarily conserved metabolic response. And it's a host of changes that happens when our body feels that it's up against a threat or that it's in danger. Hence the name cell danger response. So there's a few different mechanisms of this. The first one is there's a mitochondrial mechanism. So when the cell danger response is activated, the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria, the parts of our cell that produce energy, they will increase well, they will actually decrease the amount of energy that they produce, which kind of has a downstream consequence of increasing reactive oxygen species, which are these free radicals, and they cause inflammation. There's also metabolic shifts, so we see a reduction in what's called, oxidative phosphorylation, which kind of changes the way that we produce energy in this process called glycolysis, and the way that we produce glucose and energy for our body. And then we have, this is the most fascinating part to me, is the way that the cell danger response impacts something called the danger associated molecular patterns, DAMPs. And, that alone causes systemic inflammation and can lead to this host of immune changes. And, when you zoom out of all of this and you think about, okay, that these three things are happening, and we know that immune cells talk to each other, and we know that those immune cells talk to other types of cells, of course that's going to lead to systemic disease, right? So that's kind of what the cell danger response is. It's our cells responding to danger. And when it thinks we're in danger for long periods of time, we live in this state of physiological stress.
What I hear us both repeating, and I hope people hear us repeating, is that this is about patterns of how the body functions. Yeah. So when we think about stress and we're like, vagus nerve, amazing. Yes, we're obsessed with vagus nerve work. We completely understand. We're like, take ashwagandha. It's like, yes. Well, that doesn't, adaptogens is like a whole thing. That doesn't answer the question of how do I, from the body to us, how do I behave, right? Like, how do I exist? So, which brings me to this really important concept for us to talk about, which is the concept of safety, Tim. And when I even say the word safety, what just comes up for you around this conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think the word harmony kind of comes to mind. I think a lot of people are striving for balance. We're never going to have balance, in my opinion. Like just even using the concept of like work-life balance, I don't want to work as much as my life is happening. I don't want equal distribution, right? Because that's to me what the word balance implies. Yeah. So, when you think about homeostasis or just stasis in general, we want our bodies to be in a place of harmony where everything is communicating effectively. When there is something that's activated, our body knows how to respond to that appropriately, not too much or not too little. And, if we don't have harmony, and again, we're existing in a physiological or psychological space where we just feel like something can happen to us, that is not safety. And anyone who's ever studied psychology, or even like in high school, if you take high school psychology, you learn about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Mm-hmm. Fundamental human need is safety. You need to have your basic needs met, but it's like we throw that out the window when we create society, or, like the way that we've set our world up is not conducive to safety. So yeah, like harmony is what comes to mind when I think of safety.
I love that. And I also think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I would say of all of the things I learned in my dietitian degree, Maslow's hierarchy of needs weirdly comes up the most. Like, it's not like the calorie counting that comes up the most. I'm like, wow, that was good. Like, thanks for teaching that, in my psychology classes, and actually in nutrition classes too. And of course, like community nutrition classes. A body that is safe in my head also doesn't need to be as prepared and doesn't need to act in a funky way. So just as much as we're saying that one traumatic, ACE, one traumatic adverse experience can lead to downstream effects of how the hypothalamus directs the rest of the body to act, I just want to make it clear that acts and moments of safety, whether it's physical safety that you're getting from something or emotional safety, can do the exact opposite. You always have to prove it to our body. I've had, my bestie, Dr. Robert Kochko, come on this podcast, and he always uses the phrase, the nervous system learns by example. So if you can show your body, look, we're cool, we're safe, you don't have to do that weird, funky stuff. That is so much more profound than taking a random supplement for like a random ashwagandha, adaptogen.
That really excites me and energizes me, because we never learn what safety feels like in our body. We don't take a course on how to achieve psychological and physiological safety. Nobody's talking about this because, we're raised in a society and in communities and in families where we're under so much chronic stress There is, many of Americans are living kind of like on the brink of losing their economic security and losing their home. People are struggling to feed themselves, and hunger for long periods of time. That's also kind of this unsafe physiology to exist in. And so, for a lot of the people that I work with, and you as well, like, I think people learn to be unsafe in their bodies, and then they become unsafe existing in the conventional medical system because maybe they've experienced like medical trauma, or they're just like not feeling like they can show up as themselves and be honest when they ask, a doctor or a healthcare professional for help. So they've never really learned how to be safe in their body. And, for me, when I work with people, it's like, I can give you a meal plan and a supplement protocol and all these things, but to me, that's just like the bare minimum that I can do for you. So, I think having these conversations early on in the relationship with someone who's going to help you take care of someone who's helping you take care of yourself, they need to help you figure out what safety is. And to me, that's your compass,
Exactly. That's why safety, I knew in this conversation, was going to be such a guiding light for us for how we're going to approach this topic. I'm a little bit tricky when it comes to clients in that I'm kind of like, yeah, we'll do supplements. Come on in. We'll have fun with functional nutrition. But what the relationship really is having that person find out what makes them feel safe, and then cultivating safety in their lives, in their friendships, in the foods that they eat, of course, and the nutrients they're intaking. But anything that you do to signal safety in the body is going to signal safety to the brain, because
Right.
like I always say, the brain and the body are not cut off. They're connected to each other. All that is happening from a physical trauma perspective is happening in the brain. All that happens from an emotional trauma perspective is occurring in the body. So that is a lot of the work that we both do, is cultivating safety.
Yeah. And, when I think about someone who's been chronically dieting, they bounce around from diet to diet, and they end up kind of blaming themselves. It's like, well, I just need to get it together. I wasn't adherent to that diet. I wasn't compliant with that diet. And they think they just need to keep trying again and again. There's a reason why that diet did not work for you. And it's not because you don't have enough discipline or willpower. It's because the diet did not feel safe from one perspective, one way or another. That did not feel sustainable for you. And I think when we talk about sustainability as it relates to nutrition or a meal plan, it has to feel safe. That meal plan has to feel like it's conducive to how you want to actually feel. And if you are constantly like forcing yourself or white knuckling your way through, which, for people like you work with and highly sensitive bodies, or people who are neurodivergent, or you've experienced trauma, we don't always need more force and compliance to feel safe. We need gentleness, we need structure, we need care and support. And, if we don't even know what safety is, or that's a foreign concept to us, we're just going to kind of stay on this hamster wheel, more diets, more supplements, more doctors. And, I've found that, having these conversations and helping people figure out what safety means for them, and that becomes their guiding light or their compass, that's life-changing. Like, that is health, destiny altering information,
I think so too. Oh, Tim, I'm going to hurt you with this question here. Here we go. So, because it's going to make your brain go with so many things that you have to tell me.
Yeah.
Okay. For most people who have high ACE scores, or otherwise have even adult, adverse experiences, safety is a foreign concept, and feeling safe actually feels unsafe.
Yes.
So let's talk about how, when we have chaos or pain in childhood, how that can play into creating like restrictive diets, creating the chaos again, and kind of reliving it again, even keeping it within the nutritional realm. I think this is really relevant and important to ask. Like, what about the people who's like everyone who don't know what it's like to feel safe, and actually feeling safe doesn't feel normal, and it doesn't feel okay, and it doesn't feel good to actually feel okay?
Yeah. Yep, my brain is like on fire at the moment. You're absolutely right.
I know I hurt you. I knew I was going to hurt you. I'm sorry.
You heard a zap. So, I think, so I kind of call this, you're referring to something, it's kind of this term that I coined called the pleasure safety paradox. And to me, this is something that, it's kind of this gray area where things that are familiar to our body and to our senses and to our mind feel safe. Familiarity is associated with safe. There's a lot of neuroscience behind that. We don't really even need to understand that, other than it's driven by dopamine, it's driven by bonding and oxytocin and some of these other hormonal things. And then so that this kind of existing in this gray area, this paradox is why people intentionally make decisions they know are bad for their health, whatever that means for the person. It's because it's familiar, or it brings them some sense of perceived safety. So like in the context of food, if I'm eating kind of what's regarded as the standard American diet, I'm eating foods that, are increasing my blood sugar, they're increasing my cholesterol, or things that many people would regard as inflammatory. And I know that when I eat these foods, I feel tired, I have joint pain, I have gut issues, I have skin reactions. There's a part of me that doesn't feel like it's worth it for me. There's a part of my nervous system that doesn't feel okay with the opposite of, cultivating, sensations in my body that feel calm and cool and collected. So it's hard to get out of that. It's really hard, and it's not something that you can do with one treatment or one supplement. It takes time. It takes understanding how all of these different things that we've talked about are interconnected. And, I kind of see it as like this ball of yarn, and in the center of it is safety. And we have to pull out, the string and get through into the core of this. But I've found, that nutrition and changing our relationship with food and focusing on that as like a step one can kind of like it leads to these downstream, the unraveling, if you will. Food is the tool. And, if we're walking around with a malnourished brain where, we have all this physiological dysfunction from trauma and autoimmunity, that doesn't feel safe. And we don't know what to go to for safety. In my work, I bring people back to food, which is something that, most of my clients are already familiar with. They want, they've tried functional nutrition, they've tried holistic nutrition, but they've only gotten so far. But using food differently can be a way for us to reconnect with our body and kind of retrain our nervous system. And it also allows us to make sure that we're giving our body and our cells what it needs to actually heal and shift out of this inflammatory state. So I don't know if that answered your question, because there is a lot there, but
sometimes you need an impetus, and sometimes you need a little bit of a shove. And it's also okay. And I always tell the story, Tim, so listeners know the story. But when I went to acupuncture for the first time, I kept asking the acupuncturist, like, am I going to feel high from this? Am I going to feel weird from this? And the acupuncturist looked at me and said, would feeling relaxed or happy be the worst thing that could ever happen to you? And I was like, kinda. Yeah, that would be really scary. I don't know what that's like. And I was like, yeah, that would actually be the worst thing that could happen. So along this journey, if you do the actions that portray safety to your body, and you treat your body with respect, and you treat your body with love, even if it's not like cerebrally and consciously acceptable for you to feel safe, the message of safety will be translated. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. I mean, it really is a rewiring. It is creating, new neural cells. It is retraining your brain, retraining your nervous system, and, hunger and fullness and satiety and, the sensory experiences from food they're all driven by the nervous system. So that's another reason why nutritionists need to be talking about, neuronutrition and this topic, because all of this is driven by the nervous system. And, if you can over a period of time, retrain your nervous system to, if you shift that center point back to where it should be, you identify what harmony is, which might change depending on your season of life, by the way, and what you have going on. You'll have that compass, you'll have something to come back to. And I think for a lot of people who have experienced trauma, they're going to psychotherapy and counseling. And I've been in therapy for 16 years, proudly. And it wasn't until I started focusing on somatic and body-based, nervous system-based therapies that I actually started making what I consider to be meaningful progress. And food is one of those things where we come back to our body, we come back to our senses, we come back to a need to be present in the moment. And, that over a period of time retrains our nervous system. It causes all kinds of things to move in the direction that we need it to go.
And I think, for many people, therapy is like probably one of the first steps that everyone knows and should take when it comes to trauma, and trauma therapy, maybe even more so, like somatic experiencing and trauma specific therapies, because they're bringing you back into most of them are bringing you back into that somatic experience. So you're not just kind of re-traumatizing yourself by talking through the traumas. And that's a whole other conversation too. But the point of this piece of our conversation is that you can signal safety through the physical parts of yourself if you're not ready to talk about those parts. You don't have to go through the brain. You can actually go through the body. Now, I would recommend everyone see a trauma therapist if they're able to, and I would recommend everyone see a therapist if they're able to, 100%. And I know that even kind of bringing these topics up, bringing the ACE survey up, can make people feel like, all right, I'm exposed a little bit. I just want to lead that into, there's so much you can do. You wouldn't believe how much you can do. And that for everything that has signaled unsafety in your body, there's a million more things that you can do to signal safety in the body. And the way that our body will perceive safety is, do we have enough food? Are we loved? Do we have shelter? Do we have whatever those safety signals are? And then there's, on a cellular level, safety as well, which is, do we have enough minerals? Is our blood sugar stable?
Yes.
Are our cells going in the right direction? Are they making the right immune cells? Are they producing things properly? When you think of nutrition for trauma, Mr. Nutrition for Trauma, what nutrients are you thinking about? What pathways in the body are you thinking about specifically?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about a lot. I mean, one that really comes to mind is, different, antioxidants and neutralizing those free radicals that we talked about earlier. So, I'm thinking about things like vitamin C and selenium and, just polyphenols and all the things that we get from like colorful fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, all of the things that we're supposed to be eating, that are also good for our heart. They're good for our brain. They're good for our skin. They're good for our tissues, our immune system. When you've experienced trauma and autoimmunity, those things are incredibly important. And again, these vitamins and minerals are needed by our cells to produce energy and to metabolize things and for our survival. This isn't something that's like, oh, well, it's cute. I'm going to take a selenium or, I'll take some vitamin C. This might help boost something. That's something else I want to just clarify, Michelle. We do not need boosted immune systems, like boosted,
We're good.
exactly. We don't need supercharged. I mean, supercharged immune system is cancer. We do not need a supercharged immune system. We need, again, harmony and stasis. So a diet that's rich in just a variety of vitamins and minerals, eating the rainbow, that I know that like people hear that so much now, but the number of people that I see that eat foods that are like 2 or 3 colors, like tan and brown and red, and we're missing the whole spectrum of nutrients, you're missing out on so many polyphenols and things that your body needs to function. So like antioxidant rich foods, vitamin C and E and A and zinc and selenium, which are also very important for thyroid function as well. If you have Hashimoto's. The other thing too is just like different B vitamins, like, B1, B6 and B12. These are really important for like cellular energy production and our nervous system function. You can get these from like whole grains, leafy greens, eggs and legumes. These are also really important for neurotransmitter synthesis. And to your point of going to therapy, if you're lacking these B vitamins and your brain and your neurotransmitters are not working properly, it's very difficult to show up and be present in therapy. It's difficult to show up and process or talk about trauma or connect with your body when you have deficiencies of these vitamins. And, I've seen B12 deficiency in particular missed in many patients who are on, like long-term, acid blocking therapy, for GERD or something. And, they're having, like neuralgias or having, pain and tingling in their hands, and they're having trouble focusing or having cognitive issues. And they're doing all the things that are supposed to be right. But again, they're walking around malnourished. So we need to correct those things. The other thing that kind of comes to mind from a nutrition perspective is like supporting the gut-brain axis, which that's a whole other episode of a podcast, making sure that we're, like promoting a healthy gut microbiota. So again, we have harmony with communication between what our gut is telling our brain and our immune system. There's even like a gut heart axis, a gut eye axis, it's wild. So, there's all kinds of different, foods, fermented foods that, kind of help with, promoting diversity and production of these healthy bacteria. And again, polyphenols, are just really important for that gut-brain axis too, and along with neurotransmitter function, like I mentioned earlier. So, different types of teas, coffees, dark chocolate, all kinds of different berries, blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, all really good for neuroinflammation as well, and just kind of telling the immune system to chill. And I think the last thing from a nutritional perspective that's important is amino acids and protein. We need protein to produce neurotransmitters. We need a host of different amino acids like tryptophan and tyrosine, which are precursors to like serotonin and dopamine and melatonin, And if we don't have enough protein and we're not producing enough of these neurotransmitters, you're going to have difficulty thinking. You're going to have difficulty focusing. You're going to have difficulty sleeping. Your mood is going to be all over the place. I think those are kind of like the key things. And for a bonus, maybe like the fifth thing might be like hydration, because that's something else I think we overlook because it's not very exciting or sexy to tell people to be hydrated. But, I read a study a few weeks ago where the majority of Americans were chronically dehydrated. And, if our cells do not have the hydration that's needed to go through these detoxification and biotransformation processes, we're not going to have proper electrolyte functions. So, making sure that, we're properly hydrated also plays a really big role in, our neurotransmitter and brain function. Whew, that was a lot.
Actually. It was really good. When we are hearing about trauma in the context of social media, we are often hearing, if you release your trauma, then you'll just magically lose weight, or you'll magically, I know it's the best, right? Or you'll magically like fix your autoimmune condition. It just happens overnight. And that's the most untrue, ridiculous thing in the world. There's subtext of what you're saying under your nutrition for trauma conversation, which is that all that you just named have served very specific functions to help the HPA axis to function in the first place, for the body to produce the molecules necessary for us to have health or mental health or any kind, and also to help reduce inflammation, which is this, that's a different episode, just talking about inflammation as a myth busting piece.
Yep.
But I think that what is important to say is that what you are not insinuating, much like what I'm talking about, is that your trauma is fixed when you take a vitamin C supplement, or that it will, even in the short term, reduce symptoms or anxiety. That's not really the goal of what you're saying. Yeah. What you're saying is that the body processes have changed. There's damage from the constant reaction of the body acting a certain way. And for your body to act in a different way, you need to provide the building blocks for it to be able to do that. Correct.
Yeah. I mean, we need the cellular fundamentals to heal and grow and recover. And, there's no trauma diet, there's no dietary protocol, for healing from trauma, because it is so individual. It's going to depend on your capacity and your nutritional status and your beliefs and your health behaviors and your culture. And these are things that, a social media post or a diet program or a supplement, they don't know you. I have to remind people all the time that diet plan does not know you. That supplement knows nothing about you. And, a lot of these supplement companies, they're marketing in a way to convince you that this is exactly what you need. And, I've seen so many people spend thousands of dollars on different neuro supplements and nootropics and adaptogens. And when I listen to them, and I just let them talk and I let them tell me my story, we come back to, you don't trust your body around food. Exactly. You don't feel safe with food. Your body is not safe. And yes, we need to address the nutritional needs of the person. But again, if we don't have that guiding compass back to safety, we're going to keep playing this game of symptom whack-a-mole. We're going to be all over the place. And, it took a long time for our bodies to be exposed to these things. It can take a while for some people to grow and heal and recover, especially after they've kind of been, misdirected for such a long period of time. Healing and growth and recovery, whether it's nutrition or therapy or whatever route you go, you're cultivating it. You're not installing it into your body. I wish we could just plug ourselves in and get like a system update, but healing is cultivated.
Yeah, my clients hate when I say this, and I'm going to say it anyway. So to all of you, but in Eastern medicine, it's the belief that for as long as it takes for a disease to develop is as long as it takes to heal from it. So people expect to like heal from quote, I'm putting that in quotes, Hashimoto's in like 3 months, or heal from these things. But what the work that both Tim and I always hope and strive to do is to lay the groundwork for a body to exist in a safe way during the time we work together. That's really the basis of it. And, I work with a lot of clients on symptomatic panic attacks and anxiety. This is a lot of the work that I've done over the years. So while the recommendations for long-term trauma safety support are also different than the recommendations for short-term, let's get you out of this anxious state so that you're okay to like function. Yeah. And so it's okay on a functional nutrition journey to have both symptom treatments and then also those really long-term strategies. And I know a lot of my clients have histamine issues. So for them, like, I wish I could just give them a freaking strawberry to start us off, but sometimes you have to prove safety even before then. And just knowing where you're at is so important, and treating the body in the state it's currently in. So don't try to treat your body from 5 years ago or treat your body in the future. If you're currently experiencing a histamine issue, it's not time to slam down some vitamin C supplements, right? Even though that might help in the long term. So what Tim, the approach you're talking about, is actually doing long-term cellular and HPA axis repair so that the body can function in a way that is not promoting the side effect of disease. Tim, you also do something that I'm just telling you do. You've never said it to me, but I know that you do, which is that you provide short-term symptom management kind of by accident by creating a really safe therapeutic relationship. What is the value of a therapeutic relationship between a nutritionist and a client, and how does that help to heal trauma on a cellular level?
I love that. So, our social experiences have a direct impact on our nervous system. Think about it at the most fundamental level. One of the reasons why we when a woman gives birth, she has a really high amount of oxytocin that gets produced in her brain, which is what creates the bond between the mother and the child. And, when we are interacting with the healthcare system, we are kind of looking for that panacea. I need some relief now. Here's what's going on with my body. And so I think most medical providers, they do what they can, which is they write a prescription, they order some tests, they create a plan for you. But we miss that the relationship dynamic between the clinician and the patient is a therapeutic intervention in and of itself. And that is, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about this, that's an opportunity for you to experience safety as a patient in that relationship. Now, you may not be able to, and every healthcare provider may not be able to create that safe and therapeutic relationship with every one of their clients or patients. But, from where I sit, I need my patients to trust me. I need them to feel safe in my presence. I need them to know that, I'm with them, and I need them to know that I see them and that I'm here to care for you. And part of caring for someone involves, their collaboration and choice and getting consent so they feel safe. And that's one of the reasons why I've been such a proponent of trauma-informed care, because, we cannot care for someone if we're not also caring for their nervous system and how they're showing up in the moment. I think the other thing that kind of comes up for me with, on that point is, I think a lot of practitioners, because of the way our healthcare system is structured and health insurance, a lot of providers are incentivized to see as many patients as possible in the shortest amount of time as possible. You can't get to know what someone truly needs or where they've been or what's going on with them in 10 or 15 minutes. And I think that's why a lot of clinicians are offering a lot of tests and prescriptions, because that's what they have to offer you in 10 or 15 minutes. Exactly. And, you and I, though, and other people that are kind of in this space take the opposite approach, where we go, we don't want these transactional relationships. We want to have actual transformative relationship dynamics with our clients. Because, yeah, I mean, ultimately it's simple. The relationship between a patient and a clinician is a therapeutic intervention in and of itself.
Yeah. So it's like while you're working on people with trauma in the long term from a nutritional standpoint, you're also as a provider, and all of us, where I really want to hold that standard is you're providing intervention by taking care of someone. You use my favorite phrase, Tim. Providers and practitioners are caretakers. Does that mean that we're all the same type? No. Like the work of a nurse, are you kidding me? That they're the most amazing people in the entire world. Like caretaking to a different level is what nurses do, But and it's not that we are responsible for someone's outcomes, because we can't, because everyone's bodies react differently, but we are responsible for creating as much of a safe environment as we can, because that in and of itself, like you said, is the therapeutic intervention, and we are caretakers. Everyone has a different role to play in healthcare, but we're caring for people, and that is so therapeutic, and that can't be overstated. So if you find a practitioner who makes you feel safe, and they are a safe person, and they are really asking for consent, not pushing you, staying within their scope, and holding just the space for you to steer the ship and you to create your own journey, that is so valuable. I can't explain how valuable that is on a cellular level. So it's just, to speak to the fact that in functional nutrition, I really believe that safety is the cornerstone of healing, and it is what all of us should be trying to do with our clients. And if you are a potential client or a current client listening, I hope that's the experience you've had, or the experience that you're wanting to gain, because it is the only way I believe that you can actually heal. It's really like safety first. It has to come first.
We need relational and social safety to heal. I think there's this really disgusting and pervasive culture of like individualism here in the West, where, it's praised and honored if you are like alone and you figure it out without any help. But that's not how we're supposed to be living. We should not be going through these really traumatic experiences and these profound healing events alone and in isolation. And many of the people that I see, and I've experienced this, my family members have experienced this, people I care about have experienced this, the people that are supposed to be caring for them, they are afraid of them because they don't actually have a connection with their primary care provider, or they've had this like really transactional relationship with like a dietitian or a nutritionist that they saw, and they were told to lose weight, eat fruits and vegetables, and keep a food diary, and I'll see you again in 6 weeks. That's not what people need. It's not what people need.
And they certainly don't need, like in my dietetics degree, when they're like, do a 24-hour recall and see what they ate over 24 hours, and then tell them that they probably ate more than they thought they ate. I'm like, why am I proving them wrong? I don't want to prove people wrong. I want to prove them right and validate their experiences. And I can't overstate that. And another thing that I can't overstate is, whoever is listening to this, there is always something you can do for your health, for your happiness. There is never a too far. There's never a no coming back. There is always something you can do to either change progression or change perception of progression when it comes to disease states. And I think finding a practitioner who makes you feel safe is, it's just the most valuable experience for myself. I mean, Tim, even our conversations, like we have heart glowing conversations with each other where I feel almost too energized sometimes, because I'm like, oh God, now I have 100 things I need to think about. But just even being around people who understand you, the value of that can't be overstated. So I would just say that anyone who wants to work with Tim, I can tell you, because we've spoken for hours on end, and I couldn't feel safer, and I don't feel safe with everyone, I'll tell you that. I'm so excited for you guys to have this opportunity, because Tim, you just opened a new leg of your nutrition practice. Can you tell us how people can work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I feel the exact same way. And I'm noticing these, like, throughout this conversation, I'm literally sitting here gripping the handles of my chair, because I'm like, I have so much to say, but I'm going to let you go. Yeah. So, I mean, neuronutrition is a relatively new field. There's only, I think, 6 neuronutrition labs across the entire United States. And, I've spent the past several years working with education companies, training other nutritionists and healthcare providers on how to provide this type of care that I'm talking about. But, I kind of just got tired of that. And I'm like, I want to go provide the care. Like, I want to do this work, and I want to be the one that actually delivers and supports people. So, I opened, the first and only neuronutrition center, the Georgia Center for Neuronutrition in the Southeastern United States. This is kind of a transformation of a local practice that I started. And I also recently opened up applications to work with people one-on-one with me. So these are people who, really want, 12 or more weeks of support to work through everything that we've just been talking about. The majority of my clients are women because about 80% of people with autoimmune disease are women. It affects women. Autoimmunity affects women at twice the rate it does men. And, they've experienced trauma. They develop that autoimmune disease after those experiences. And, they've worked with like functional nutritionists or health coaches, and they've gone the conventional route, and things just aren't working. And, I've found that neuronutrition, an approach to nutrition that is very kind of nervous system and brain focused and oriented, it kind of allows us to break through things that people have been struggling with for a long period of time. And, I have no miracles here, just let me be clear, I have no miracles, but, this
Besides your existence, which is gone.
Yeah. And I mean, this approach is new, it's emerging, and it has changed my life. Like I said in the beginning of this episode, learning about all of this truly altered my health destiny. It altered the health destiny of my family. And I see it as a privilege to bring this to people. Truly. I think that talking about our health and opening up about these experiences is incredibly intimate, and it means a lot to me when people trust me to take care of them.
I love that you shared your ACE score, by the way. And I hate what your ACE score is. And I just want to tell you that throughout this time, I've been thinking how angry I am that your ACE score is an 8. Mine's a 4. And I'm angry. Yeah, I'm angry that yours is, but I'm going to work through my anger on your ACE score, by the way. And I just think the way I really think about you, Tim, is like, I know how much adverse childhood experiences and or trauma can impact us. And I'm so glad you're here and helping people, because you are like an unstoppable light. And I really, really believe that. So I'm so grateful that you are. I'm proud of you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I truly see this as a privilege to do this type of work. And it's funny, when I think about things that I've experienced in my life, this has always been here. This has always been a special interest of mine, and feeling this way about wanting to help other people care for them in this way has always been there. And, opening this up, has affirmed that, I'm onto something here. And,
hell yeah. You're onto more than something. You're onto it. I think. Also, listen, I'm going to tease Tim now. I haven't teased him this whole time. If you can make it through his application form, you got 6 pages of consent, because he is so legitimately trauma informed. And I know that will change as time goes on. So when people are listening to this episode for years to come, because I know they will, maybe Tim's application form will only be 6 or 7 pages instead of the whatever it is. But I'm so grateful you're in this work. I'm so excited for anyone who gets to work with Tim. You guys are like the luckiest ever. And I really believe that. Tim, where else can people find you? And of course, I'm going to put all your links in the show notes, but just let us know, where else can people find you?
Yeah. I mean, the best place to learn from me for free is Instagram. My handle is Nutrition for Trauma. And then my website is timfrie, timfrie.com. And yeah.
And Tim, are you releasing the notes that you had for this podcast episode?
Yeah. So we'll have all of my notes, which is right now 20 pages. By the time I get done reformatting them, it'll probably be even more, but yeah, that'll be timfrie.com/QTD. You can get all of these notes. I'll send them to you by email.
I can't wait. I'm going to put that link right in the bottom too. It was the light of my life and the light of this season to sit down with you, Tim. Thank you so much. We will see you next season and probably every season permanently. So thank you so much.
Thanks again for the opportunity.